Now, my friends, we left off on our last tape. We said that this one we would begin to speak of the two worlds of Noah in that far-off age and the ancient days of antiquity. We go back in Genesis 6th chapter and the 2nd verse. It clearly states that the sons of God, we're assuming that this is the Adamic man through the line of Seth. It said that they saw the daughters of men, of the men of the non-Adamic race that preceded them to this world. We believe that many of them, that they were descendants of the great Khans, referred to and washed down to Cain, who had come to this earth as exiles. As I believe that we prove quite conclusively that they were kicked off. And so these people, that they were of a different capacity, that spiritually that they were inferior to what had been genetically programmed into this Semitic type man that was to come later. He who was to catalog all of the different types of creature and livestock that was upon this earth. Now, if this was just one single man, it would have been a physical impossibility. So we turn to Genesis the 6th chapter, 4 and 5. It repeats the same information in slightly different words, bodily implying that the corruption of the earth. Now, my friends, all of this time, for centuries, we have assumed that they were talking about this world. And so was it speaking of this earth that these people have referred to the master builders, or shall we say the mysterious builders of antiquity that appeared in different parts of this globe, and then suddenly great architecture and science begin to appear, as we find the evidence that we pointed out in other chapters of our book that records finely ground lens. And everybody, through reading the Reader's Digest series and all, they finally got on the bandwagon. It's a real money maker there, talking about these strange things and showing the proof that there was brain surgery went on back in the days of great antiquity and so forth. And so, as we say in the 6th chapter of Genesis, verses 4 to 5, they repeat pretty much the same information, only slightly different words here, and they're implying the corruption of a particular world, that people have assumed that it was an Adamic earth, or the home of these strange and mysterious builders who came from beyond the star, and they try to tell us now which participated, I mean to say, in the deluge that resulted from the union of these sons of God with the daughters of men. Now, there is a possibility, like I told you about in the Proverbs, the 8th chapter, right in the very beginning there, it talks about these sons of God. They come down and they visited with the children of men in the habitable parts of the earth. So apparently there's parts that weren't habitable. But I don't believe that we can tie it down and pin it down that this is what caused the great deluge. And I've through the years run into some of these teary-eyed people who said to me, how could the Almighty be so cruel and destroy all the poor little innocent children? And I said, well, if you go back and you find out that he sealed up the womb about 100 years before that. This was the days that people hadn't got into the junk food and they were living off of the natural things, but due to the mixing of the sons of God with the daughters of men, it brought about a great catastrophe wherever it happened. So, but we still haven't learned a lesson by this, but I have another tape that we've lectured on that we cover that subject a little better, so I will leave it alone. But this flood, let's keep this in mind, that it resulted from the union of the sons of God with the daughters of men. Now, Genesis 10:5 also is a very potent witness of the fact that the whole globe, it was scourged, or so it would appear, the fact the whole globe was scourged by the flood. The verse is now quoted intact and verbatim for the convenience of you, the listener, and then they would have us believe that by these, Noah's sons and their descendants, they were to escape the deluge. Or they assumed that they were Noah's sons, because I would remind you, you may write me your nasty letters, and I'll be honest with you, probably go in the round file, because I don't have time to argue with people or get into long correspondence proving every jot and tittle. I just say to people, listen to the tapes, look it up for yourself, and accept it or reject it. Because, friends, I'm not looking for followers. I'm not starting a church building. I don't want people sitting on my doorsteps, and I do not claim to have all of the answers. But I'm searching and opening up a lot of avenues for you to consider so that you don't become one of these mushhead religionists that's overripe because of the sloppy agape. But, excuse me, I have to remind you once again of Ezekiel, the 14th chapter. What was it, a half a dozen times there? They said they saved not son or daughter. Go back and you read Job. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And I have pointed out to you before, you cannot believe what a great catastrophe that actually went on there. And the Greeks tell about it, and they understood it better than the so-called Christendom or the religious world today. The sons, the 7 of them, they represented greater worlds, and the daughters, 3 of them, represented smaller worlds. And then a wife represented 1. And then Job, he constituted the 12. I don't know. I've got to be very honest. And a lot of people ask me about this, I believe it's Theodore Sitchin. And I've skimmed 3 of his books. And I think that he's probably one of the outstanding writers of our time. You can take all these other UFO books and strange books and unexplained books of mystery and so forth. But this man, he seems to know his onions. He seems to have the facts together, and he brought out some pretty exciting things. Now, let's understand something. Let's reason together with me. This Messiah, this Yeshua, this Emmanuel incarnate, the Savior of his people, he points to Noah, and my friends, I really don't believe Christendom ever understood a thing about it. And why the world, I said, of Noah was destroyed. And then points out on a smaller scale of Sodom and Gomorrah. In other words, a flashback. In this case, it was only 2 wicked cities. But the only thing we learn by history is that we do not learn by history. And you think that all of these swishy people from the Swiss Alps here in our nation and this world, they would learn, but they don't. That is what I find so very sad. But the point is that if Job, none of his family was spared, well, why in the world was Noah's family spared? When Ezekiel in the 14th chapter said, hey, Noah didn't save his sons or his daughters, just like Job. Job didn't save any. We read the account of Job. He lost everything. He lost his livestock, his great estates, his mansions, all of his great wealth. He lost it all. See, consider that. Keep that in mind. So now, there's something wrong with this Genesis account and Noah and his sons by these so-called Noah's sons and their descendants who supposedly escaped the deluge, where the isles of the Gentiles or the shall we say, Noatian people were divided into their lands, and every one of them after his tongue and their families and their nations. And this is something else that the people ignore today. See, God is a racist. If he was standing here in the person, he'd call a bit. It's prophesied, it is written, as Christ said himself. He never gave you chapter and verse. That was added centuries later. But he said, it is written. In those days he will again set the bounds on all nations. It talks about the calamity and the hell that's coming down on this earth, and says, every man shall flee back to his own nation, and the Almighty will put every man back under his own vine and his own fig tree, and never again will man transgress this divine holy law, because the Almighty said he made everything it was, and he made it after his own kind. So if this offends the government, if this offends the church, then that means that God offends you. And then maybe that puts you in a position you are offensive to the Almighty. Now, goes on, he talks about, he said he put them in there after their tongues and after their families and their nations. And the time with which the passage deals with was supposedly shortly after the flood or the great deluge, only after 2 short generations removed from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they would have us believe the sons of Noah. And then we go back and we see in Genesis 10th chapter, verses 2, 3, and 4, and it tells us the flood did destroy all human life on the whole globe except for the one family of Noah. And as some so stoutly maintain, and now I would ask them this: how does it happen that within just 1 century after this great tragedy, now reason with me, friends, or approximately thereabouts, that there were still so-called Gentiles on the earth? Gentiles, my friends, means nations. Whether it's a heathen nation or whether it's a nation of Christendom, the Semitic people, what have you. Now, how does it happen that these nations were not all living there on the plains of Shinar? You remember, my friends, where they fought the gold of Ophir, and tens of thousands of men died there? We proved this in our other tapes and the books, where I believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's my opinion, that the Phoenicians were in reality the Mayans, who preceded the Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Adamic, Nordic, Carry-on, Teutonic, Lombardic, Germanic, and Basque type people. And we remember, as we read there in the Old Testament, that these Phoenicians, who I maintain were the Mayans, that every 3 years they brought this gold to Solomon. I think Solomon, this was one of his downfalls and his hanky-pank, and he was being bought off by these Mayans, or we get from the name the people of Mu, who brought the 40 tons of gold to Solomon from Peru, and we went through all that, how they had to go up and down the river and the water courses, and it's not easy, because everything would have to depend on what time of year when the rivers are up, and 40 tons, my friends, that's 80-some thousand pounds. So that's a lot of gold to transport. But we remember that we talk about who were these people. They weren't all of the same blood of Noah and his issue that were living here, and they were living in the plains of Shinar, and they had families also, and even nations. And indeed, these so-called Gentile, or these heathen nations, they would had to have been workers of miracles, to say the least, to have multiplied so rapidly and so fast as to father whole nations within just a few years. Stop and figure it out, my friends. Mathematically, genetically, none of this computes if we start to think a little bit. It is well, too, that we figure in this connection to examine, go back and look again at Genesis 10:32 with care, especially the latter part where it reads, and it goes on, by these, the families of the sons of Noah, were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. And it goes on about all the factors that apply to the discussion here of Genesis 10:5 and the preceding paragraphs that we've quoted to you here, apply to the passage also, how any student of this deluge narrative can also read verses in the Bible, such as the one that we're quoting, and thinking